Muy buenas, compañeros y compañeras. Mi nombre es Rubén Hernández y para mí, como siempre, es un auténtico placer estar en un episodio más de la radio FisioPodcast. En el episodio de hoy os traigo la entrevista que María Galve realizó a Philippa en el ya pasado primer Congreso Internacional del Afrontamiento Activo del Dolor Crónico que se celebró en Valladolid. Desde aquí, pues dar las gracias a María por su predisposición y ayuda para poder realizar esta entrevista. Ya sabéis que mi inglés, digamos que está todavía en construcción. Y gracias también, por supuesto, a Philippa por acceder a la entrevista y permitirnos conocer un poco más la figura de Louis Gifford desde un punto de vista algo más personal. El Congreso Internacional de Afrontamiento Activo fue una experiencia única por muchos motivos que posiblemente solo los que asistimos tenemos la suerte de conocer, pero sí quería aprovechar este pequeño hueco para daros las gracias a todos los que me parasteis, ya sea en el auditorio o en la cena que tuvimos, para darme muestras de cariño relacionadas con el podcast. Verdaderamente me abrumó tanto cariño, así que de nuevo gracias y espero que nos veamos muchas más veces en persona. Si no tuviste la suerte de venir al Congreso, pues te recomiendo que biches en Twitter el hashtag Afrontamiento Activo Dolor, donde podrás ver los momentos estelares del Congreso y así hacerte un poco a la idea de cómo transcurrieron las jornadas. Aprovecho también este hueco para comentaros que habrá pequeñas modificaciones en el podcast y una de ellas es que a partir de ahora todas las entrevistas se subirán en formato vídeo a nuestro canal de YouTube. De hecho, si nos estás viendo desde ahí, pues posiblemente nos estemos viendo cara a cara. Si todavía no estás suscrito al canal, pues te recomiendo que vayas a YouTube/FisioPodcast, te suscribas y así no te pierdas nada de nuestro contenido. Sin más, os dejo con la entrevista. Espero que la disfrutéis tanto como nosotros hicimos grabándola y que saquéis algo en claro de cara a mejorar vuestra práctica clínica. Esto es FisioPodcast.
Hello, everybody. My name is Maria, and we have here today Philippa. Philippa, would you mind saying to the rest of the audience who you are?
My name's Philippa Tindle. I'm a physiotherapist, and I suppose I'll be more known really for being Louis Gifford's partner and wife. Louis is well known internationally through his writing and lecturing, and I suppose I would always call myself the person behind him. So I'm here I'm being invited here very generously by a group of very good people to actually pay tribute to Louis' legacy, which I find quite overwhelming. So thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. I think the honour is absolutely ours. I'm personally delighted to be here with you and have the opportunity to interview you.
Yeah, thank
so
you.
I hope I ask the questions that most people want to know
Yeah.
about. I suppose my first question, and probably you will be talking about this later on in the tribute, is how this evolution of the pain theory came about.
Okay.
What was going on through Louis and your head at the time?
Okay, I suppose I will have to go into a little bit of history. Louis and I were both trained in our first degrees in zoology, which is the study of animals. And Louis then went on and actually did a postgraduate certificate in education, which meant he could be a teacher. And he lectured in West Africa in botany and zoology.
That's something you didn't know.
No. And both his parents were physiotherapists. And his father and mother actually were teachers in the southwest of England in Bath School of Physiotherapy, which is probably about an hour from London, and then they moved further west to where we live now in Cornwall, and his father was the boss at the physiotherapy hospital. And Louis, I think, didn't really know what he wanted to do, but he'd watched his father actually manipulate an old fisherman in the pub, and the fisherman, I believe the story is in the Aches and Pains book, but he tells the story of watching this amazing amazing sort of theatre, and thinking, well, I maybe would quite like to do a bit of that. And basically he then had applied for physiotherapy. I had done zoology, but I love talking. So I decided to apply for physiotherapy too, and we met on day one at physiotherapy training in 1978. And I suppose we worked in college together a little bit and got together as a couple in 1981. And interestingly, actually, a friend of our son's came to see me last week, and he is a late student of physio. He's 34 now and has done many other things, but he's just started his training in Edinburgh. And I said to him, how's it going? And he said, well, it's really confusing. He said, we get taught one thing at college, and then you go out on placement. And he said, they all tell us different things. And he said, we really don't know what to do. And I said, well, all I'm going to say is it was exactly the same for us 41 years ago. Which is
the same country everywhere.
So it's the same. And I said, all I can say is that we've come through it, and it's a fantastic profession, and you never stop learning. Even I tried to close the clinic in April of this year, and I was still learning the day I stopped with the last patient. Anyway, so it was quite an insight to hear a student sort of say, we're confused, because we were confused. But we were introduced by one of our tutors into the Maitland concept, which was in the 80s was sort of flourishing throughout the world, an Australian physio who was a manual therapist. And we felt that's where we wanted to go. And we chose work in the UK alongside people who we knew were teaching and were educators too, and publishing. And I say in my talk later that if you get the opportunity to move to work alongside good people, do it, because we learnt so much from these people, and it was a great experience. We then went to Adelaide to do the manipulative therapy 1-year course in 85 and 6, and we worked with Jeff in his clinic. And at that time, I think Louis was starting to get quite frustrated with what he was, what we'd been taught and what he was seeing in the clinic, because Jeff's clinic actually attracted the hardest to help patients. He was known throughout, this is what happens if you become a name or a guru, as they call them, or they did call them. And we were basically treating chronic pain patients with techniques that were obsolete. You know, we were all tissue-based trained. Everything was in the tissues. And, you know, Louis came home. He said, I think I'm going to go and work in a building site. He said, I'm not helping anybody. You know, they're getting either not better or just disappearing in spite of me. And I think he was always curious. I think not just in physiotherapy, but in, you know, I mean, if you went for a walk, we collected mushrooms, and then you had 5 books to identify them. There was only a couple of times when we were poorly. If you went out, you know, he was a botanist, so you'd collect flowers. If he went windsurfing, he had to go rail riding, and getting it, you know, he
very
just had
curious mind.
A curious and inquisitive, which was lovely. And in fact, sorry, slight aside, but he always wanted to learn something new each day, and he would say to our boys, when he came in from work in the evening, because our clinic was adjacent to our house, and they'd be sitting around the kitchen table, you know, he'd say, well, what have you learnt today? And of course they just went, can't remember, you know.
Typical.
Typical. And it became quite a joke, because he, you know, if you went on a walk, you'd try a different route, because he was curious, but in a lovely way. And it was for his own it wasn't ambition, it was just his curiosity and inquisitiveness. So we sort of came back from Adelaide, and actually we went down to work in Cornwall, and took over Louis. His father had died and his mum had carried on working, and we actually took over the practice and was sort of hid because it had been quite full on in Australia. Louis' year in '85 was a great cohort of physiotherapists. Mark Jones from America, who's written books on clinical reasoning. David Butler and Louis. David had looked into Bob Elvey's work in adverse neural tension, and Louis and David wrote and talked together for many hours, as we did with all the rest of the group. So it was a great time of having a year of being with influential people who were also curious. So again, if you get that opportunity to study, do it. And we actually had all our tutors there, which one of the things we really liked was that they were all clinicians in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they came and they brought stories from the morning. And I think Louis would always say, when he was teaching, which he did for many years, and his courses were well received, that he was a clinician and not a researcher. And he would always bring patient stories to the group. And they believed him because he actually had seen that patient, the week before. And the other thing of living in one town, a small town, maybe only 25,000 people, is that you actually saw the truth. We should have really done a longitudinal study over the 35 years we were there, because you would meet people out in the supermarket and they'd say, "Oh, you were right, it did take a year to get better." So you actually felt quite a responsibility to your community and your patients.
It's called real life data now.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
There you are. I mean, on that note, I think Louis would always say that he had a lovely encounter, number of encounters with Patrick Wall in the 90s, and Patrick Wall was a real, champion of physiotherapists, and said, you bring us what you're finding in the clinic, and we'll try and find out why and what is happening. And the single case study, I think Louis would always say he would promote, because there, maybe when, we call it serendipity, or where you have the unexpected happen, which then becomes the norm, so to speak. So these are sort of things that are just coming to mind as I'm talking, if that's all
brilliant.
Right.
And at the moment, I'm just hearing all these names and said all those brains put together.
Right. It was
unreal.
It was. We were at a time which was a good time, and Louis was really delving into other disciplines, publishing work through the pain science. He describes, which I will again later, reading one of Patrick Wall's papers and having what we call a aha experience, where you go, "Oh, the light bulbs, I get it. We understand what you're trying to get at." And so he was constantly reading and questioning his own practice, and really not accepting, but in a very nice way, which he never binned other people's ideas. He just said, "Well, could you think about it like this?" So I think he was very humble in that sense. But he went back to Adelaide in, I think, 93. They were doing a short master's program, which I stayed home, and I ended up doing an art degree, which was very nice, and looked after the kids and ran the clinic. And he had some space out there and wrote the Clinical Biology of Aches and Pains 2-day lecture program, which he presented there for the first time. And then when he came back to the UK, he was asked to start presenting that. So he was putting his physiology knowledge. He loved stress biology because he felt it was very close to the pain biology, and he wanted to make sense of the patients in front of us, really. and that's how he found a way. So there was a lot of teaching going on in that sense. He spent time at the Input Pain Management Unit in London, and he was sort of blown away by we'd come in from a manual therapy sort of background, while these physios didn't know what we were talking about, and we didn't know what they were talking about. But it was a lovely marrying of minds, and sort of the Physiotherapy Pain Association was started by Heather Munsey, Jan Williams, Vicky Harding, and they are all co-authors in the Topical Issues in Pain series, because Louis felt that those study days that we organised were too good to just be gone, and he asked all of the lecturers if they would write up their papers, and then we published between, I think it was 98 and 2006. So it was a very fertile time. There was it was exciting. There was an awful lot of things going on.
It's a lot of nurturing, I can hear.
Sorry?
It's a lot of nurturing from everybody's brains, and really kind of helping each other. And
that's very much so. And discussions with people who, you met people because you went out of your way to meet people, and people who came on Louis' courses, some that wasn't for them, but he was always you were always trying to shift people's their beliefs and behaviours, but there was an awful lot of people, and we were out there and I would say he was very prepared to go down other people's rabbit holes, but he was also very prepared to put his head above the parapet. And I know you asked me about how did he deal with critics, and I will tell a story, but he dealt with them really well. Is probably all I'll say, because he felt it was actually part of what we should be doing, and we should be as a profession. And interestingly, I was listening to one of Mick Thacker's podcasts last week, because I thought, I'm coming here, I better see what's going on out there. And Mick is very interested that we actually question our practice constantly. And I think I would say Louis did that, till the day he died, really. He was always reading and always moving to something else. And so the mature organism model came the frustration of going, what I've been taught doesn't fit, and also his need to make some sense. And there wasn't one day he went, oh, look at this. It was the clinical biology of aches and pains course, it was the nerve root, it was the graded exposure lecture program, and he was able to, he put it together, and it was first published in Physiotherapy Journal in the UK in 1998, and then in the Topical Issues in Pain 1, which was published in 1998 for the first time. And he would have been so pleased that it has resonated, and that people have found it a useful teaching tool. And I had to think long and hard at the beginning of the week when I knew I was coming here. If he'd lived, I think essentially it would have remained as it was, but I think he would have developed other models, because I think he didn't sort of stand still and go, I'm done. He just wanted to always make life better for himself, in the sense to prevent burnout. Is that a term you know here?
Yes. I think we all know what it is.
Also to make the life of patients better.
You always had the patient in mind.
Absolutely, yeah. And, he didn't, our clinic in Falmouth, we had everybody from the local farmers who just wanted to say, "Oh, come on, Louis, will you just fix me?" There was, I probably I should say, probably in the when we first, well, not when we first went back, but in the 90s when he was so full of all this stuff, he probably made it too complicated for patients, his explanations, and by probably 5 years on, 10 years on, I think we pared it right back and simplified it.
And I think that's something I wanted to ask you, because you've mentioned the book Aches of Pain, which I recommend anybody to read if they haven't done so yet. You've mentioned the aha moments, and you've also mentioned how your explanations and communication to the patients has changed and evolved.
Yeah.
So can we get some tips from the evolved communications? Okay. What can we implement into our practice?
Well, I think you've got to be very comfortable with what you know yourself. And if you don't really understand it, you struggle to then explain it. We were very aware of people, I suppose it's the word, latching on to other people's metaphors. And rather than using their own, I think you should be your own therapist. Even if you don't understand it, don't try and pretend you do. Is that okay to say?
And it's very honest.
Yeah, I think so. It is. And I think in the clinic, he, as I say, with some patients, you get a sense. One of the huge skills he learned actually from Jeff Maitland was Jeff's communication. It was actually worth sitting listening on the other side of the cubicle, that's what they were, with Jeff, and hearing how much information and how he allowed what he used to call parallel thinking, where he allowed a patient to run with what was the problem, and we learnt an awful lot rather than the systematic tick 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 when you're a novice to an expert.
So listen to the patient.
Yeah, but listen to them. We'd often say the patient's been sitting in our waiting room. They've desperate to tell you, and they walk in. And if you're too busy on your screen, or your however you record, and you don't give them eye contact, you actually miss probably what the first 4 sentences are probably the key sentences. They sort of tell you what's wrong. They tell you how you're going to get them better, and they give you everything in that paragraph. And again, I was listening to Mick last week. He was discussing the sort of length of time you have with a patient. In Adelaide, we had 15 minutes. It's not long, is it?
You just about managed to say hello.
Yeah,
how are you?
And maybe take your top off
Yes.
if that's relevant. But over time you can get all the information if you listen and hear what the patient tells you. And again, we spent a lot of time finding different ways of listening and different ways of hearing and different ways of interviewing patients, which was key to really improving our life as physio and the patient's life. So the overload of information, he had a phase where he would give patients handouts and all sorts of stuff, and he said, I think, and then they would come back, and of course they only heard this, and so he sort of he sorted it out. And then I suppose near the end it was always like, well, it's just, all we're doing, and can be the talking, the hands, any interaction with a human being, it's sort of input, processing and output, and patients got it better than medical people and physios, so that was always interesting. But I don't know, you may have read somewhere, he was always keen. He said patients want to know 4 things. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Would you care to say?
Okay. He said when you go to the doctor, he's actually written a small foreword in a book called Red Flags, which I have got a copy with me. He said they want to know what's wrong, how long, what can I do to help myself, and what can you offer me? And he felt in the sort of more recent, before he died, he felt it was quite important that he could answer those questions with every patient, and he answered them. He didn't get everyone better, far from it, but he was able to answer those questions. So a patient would often, we only had the facility in Falmouth, we had 45-minute appointment sessions, not 15.
That probably helped.
Yeah, but they would just come once, because they'd say, "Oh, well, I know what's wrong. You've told me how long." People couldn't afford to come. We're private practitioners, and I'm happy that you're happy. I trust you, and I believe you because you've listened to me. He always did a really good physical examination that was relevant, and he had good hands, and he just made sure the patient knew why they were doing
he had the
movement.
ability to develop that therapeutic alliance straight from the
straight away. So it was so he again sort of simplified it to those things which I'm not sure I would use. It was because he'd had 30 years of experience. I think you can get there faster, but I think it's sort of more fun if you you learn more from your disaster. You learn more from your disasters than you do from your successes. Is all I'll say. The ones when you went, when they've come back and repeated what they heard from you.
Yes, and not exactly what you wanted to say.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't know if that is helpful. We always looked for pink flags, which are I would always say, if I'm into looking at a patient's movement, I say I'm actually probably more interested in the things that you can do rather than the things you can't do. And that immediately sort of flipped the interview to being a positive.
So you're looking for health rather than pain.
Yeah, absolutely. We always looked for in fact, I think right at the back of one of Louis' books, he had a patient wrote to me after he died, and she wrote something like, thank him, because she was a young girl who'd had to have a hip replacement. And he said something like to her, would you please stop grimacing? Because it really is not attractive. And he was confident enough in the context of knowing that patient. And she found that actually just like talking to a friend, and it made her go, I don't need to grimace. As I say, I've sort of taken away a lot of information there, but he didn't just say get better and things like that. But they were the skills that I think we all developed. And I think I'll just say one thing, because again about the patient walking in, they often say a sentence, which is their most important one. They've sat there thinking about it, and I would do the same. We'd jot that sentence down in italics on your notes. We always resisted going digital in our notes, and I know I can pick up Louis' notes, which I have to keep for so many years at home, and I can visualize that whole patient, and I can see his thoughts process through the whole thing. And they're actually, I've had to especially shred some of them, but it's quite interesting reading. I can pick up those notes, and I can see the patient. Not that I knew them, but I know from everything. So he wrote a lot, but often those key points. And then maybe someone came back again. He would use that sentence back to them, and they liked it. He'd listened. It helped to do that sort of thing. So there were tricks you learn, and I'm sure many, physios do it almost, sort of subliminally. We're good communicators, but we can be better.
We can be better.
Yeah,
exactly.
we can be better.
So it's been an actual lovely pleasure listening to you. I just have one final question, because we do have to get ready for a tribute at some point today. Right. If you were able to summarize Louis' legacy in one word or one sentence, what would it be? Well, I'm call upon his good friend Mick again, who I can't say it verbatim, but I am going to in my talk. That he actually made a patient's
our patients or people's lives better. And he was very generous with his knowledge and his teaching. And he had no he had no ego, and he was extremely humble. Mick says it much better than I do, and it is a lovely thing. So it's really about the being a human being.
Well, I think clearly we can be better at that.
Yeah.
Philippa Tindle, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Right.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.